Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? This is the next session on liberalism, one of the most important sessions that we're going to cover. This is the fifth session, I think, altogether. And today we're going to be focusing on social liberalism. As many of you will know, liberalism is subdivided into three different categories: social, political, and economic. Today the emphasis will just solely be on social liberalism, and we're going to encourage more discussions within the group that we have here in attendance. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the Qari to read very brief lines in the poetry on social liberalism, inshallah ta'ala.
فصل الليبرالية من الهوى إلهه ليبرالي لذته حاكمة الفعال فأنت حر حيث لم تضر فازني وشذ واشربن خمرا فإن تسله عن زنا المحارم أجاب فورا سيء وخارم وإن توافقا ولم يحصل ضرر وإن ذا مناقض ولا مفر.
Now, these particular abiyat, or these particular lines of the poetry, were talking about social liberalism. And in fact, social liberalism, or liberalism in this way, can be defined by the harm principle. Now, who knows what the harm principle is? Let's start with a question to get you guys warmed up. Yes. Here, please check it, yes. Yeah, so it's a very good answer. You can do what you want so long as you don't harm anyone else. In fact, some have defined liberalism thusly, using this particular principle. So you can do what you want so long as you don't harm anyone else. This is their ethic. Now the question is, why is that their ethic? There are many presuppositions at play here, really. But before we get to that, before we get to the kind of epistemology of it, or the philosophy of it, or the metaphysics of it, I think it's important to think a little bit about the application of it. And this is what the poetry was talking about. So what is the application of it? We're talking about, well, homosexuality or LGBTQ. This is, if you ask somebody who's part of that community how you justify it, this is the staple or stock response that you will get. So long as they're not harming anyone, why are you getting involved in their business? They are two people who are in love with each other, man and man, woman and woman, and they love each other. So why are you getting involved in their business? If they want to have intercourse with each other, rectally or anally or orally or otherwise, this is none of our business. This is something that concerns two consenting adults, okay, that can do whatever they like. Now, in application, historically, obviously these kinds of arguments became more and more powerful after the civil rights movement in 1960s. Coincidentally, maybe not, the same kind of time when feminism, second wave, which we already spoke about, became popular as well. And it's really astonishing to see in the last 60 years, really, how the landscape has changed, how the DSM register, which is the register that psychologists use to assess mental illness, has kind of stripped away anything about homosexuality, and now, if anything, they're probably going to introduce homophobia. It's really amazing how things can take a change. But what I was going to say was this: has there been consistency in the way that the West, in particular, for example, let's say the United States, Canada, America, England, Western Europe, and other countries that have been most vocal about this, and that have had the most sudden changes of law, has there been consistency in the way that they have implemented that particular principle as it relates to sexual relations? Now, you might have heard me say this before, but the argument I put forward is not really, it's a historical argument. Now, if you look in the last 60 years, you'll find that incest rights, for example, have not been given the same promise or the same privileged position as homosexual rights. Now, one may say there are some major differences between incest and homosexuality, and some may even invoke a power relation between mother and child, or mother and son, I should say, not child, mother and son, both, let's say, over the age of 18, father and daughter, say this is a power relationship, which is a really pathetic argument. But let's, to kind of bypass this academic discussion, talk about siblings, a brother and sister, and so on. If they were to indulge or engage in this kind of sexual activity, and they prevent deformed babies from happening by using some kind of contraception, or indeed not even engaging in a vaginal way, there are other ways you can have intercourse, then would this not, surely, this should be in line with the principle that you are free to do whatever you like so long as you don't harm anyone else. Because if a brother and sister wanted to have intercourse with each other and have a relationship with each other and be in a romantic, non-platonic relationship with each other, then surely they should have been able to do so. Now someone will say, who's consistent, and this is what you will maybe sometimes find, yeah, I agree with you. Someone could actually agree with that. So yeah, well, absolutely. It's not about you agreeing with me now. This is a historical argument, in fact, because in the last 60 years, this is simply not been the case. You've had countries that have, and you still have countries that illegalize sibling relationships, incest. They make it illegal to engage and indulge in that kind of sexual activity. We have not seen an uproar within kind of liberal society about incest rights, nor, quite interestingly, we haven't even seen that within LGBTQ communities. I don't know why there's not LGBTQI for incest in there. It would make a lot more sense if there was. In fact, there have been their anti-normative practices, to use their terms, the intersectional terms, anti-normative practices of the incestuous kind, if you want to put them, or those who are orientated in an incestuous way, have been sidelined and according to them have been oppressed. You know, they have been suppressed. We talk about coming out of the closet, come out of the homosexuality closet. Why not come out of the incest closet? You know, why is it now you've specialized a closet for homosexual people, but you haven't specialized a closet for incestuous relationships? In fact, we were talking about psychology last time. There is actually more to be said by way of psychoanalysis in terms of incest than there is to be said about homosexuality. Well, I'm referring here to the Oedipus complex, but not just that. The Oedipus complex, as Sigmund Freud had this thought that in the, he calls it the phallic state, or not phallic, sorry, the psychosexual stages of development, when someone is just growing up, that the child, he says, is attracted to the opposite gender. So the daughter is attracted to the father and the son is attracted to the mother in a sexual capacity. So according to this, obviously it's a controversial topic, but it has some level of, at least with Freud, some level of clout, if you want to call it that. Why not introduce incest in the discussion of suppression or lack thereof? So these are just some things that were in the poem that I thought were important to put forward, because it is a really important argument. When I spoke to many people, you can see this kind of on YouTube, I spoke to homosexuals who justify homosexuality, and I put this to them. A lot of them get very, very angry. A lot of them try and attack me, actually. One person tried to spit on me and attack. Why? Because it somehow strikes a nerve when you make the comparison between incest and homosexuality, because you're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place. What are you going to say? It's unnatural? I mean, if you say that, then you're really doing it for yourself, isn't it? If you're going to say it's not the same, it's disanalogous, okay, well actually it doesn't need to be exactly analogous. All sexual activity, by virtue of the fact that's anti-normative, all it needs to be is consenting between two adults. It doesn't have to be necessarily like for like analogous. And so these are the kind of things, that thought-provoking things that I want people to think about today, because these kinds of arguments go a very, very long way. They go a very, very long way by way of deconstructing, really, the way, and this, I've just mentioned this, the way that the liberal paradigm has been implemented. And we're not yet even speaking about what it's about, or the discussions about how you prove the principle of utility, or how you prove this or that. So, you look at the first slide. We said already that it can be defined through the harm principle. And you've got to understand that the harm principle was put in place, as you mentioned, by John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill, his father was called James Mill, okay? And his father's friend was called Jeremy Bentham, okay? Now, Jeremy Bentham was himself a heavyweight philosopher of the utilitarian complexion. So he was a utilitarian. He believed that, in his words, these are his words, he says, you have two lords. You have the Lord of pain and you have the Lord of pleasure. Now, what does that remind you of in the Quran? Let's, for those who remember or know the ayah. Yeah, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen the one who has taken their own desires as their Lord? And here you have Jeremy Bentham literally formalizing this. Because the principle of the hedonistic principle already was part of the liberal discourse. John Locke had put it in there. Hedonism is this idea of expression in that sense, whether it be sexual, whether it be intellectual, because don't forget, we don't want to strawman these people. It's not just sexual or aggressive urges or whatever it may be. It's also intellectual stuff, whatever you really want to do to express yourself as a human being. So the hedonistic principle is already in place, but here you have Jeremy Bentham really formalizing the point that you have two lords. You have the lord of pain and you have the lord of pleasure. And the point of life, according to Bentham, which obviously John Mill and James Mill both agreed with, is that you minimize pain and you maximize what? Pleasure. And Jeremy Bentham would continue on to say that now as an ethic, that what we should have is the greatest good for the greatest number. So basically, you have as many people that are happy and have pleasure as possible, and we minimize the amount of people that have what? Pain as possible. This is how morality should be predicated, or on which principle morality should be predicated. This is the idea, yeah? So someone can say, well, on that basis, why don't we justify gang rape? We get 10 women. Well, actually, we should say 10 men. If it was 10 women, it wouldn't be, I don't think, a controversial example. I think if we say 10 men, all right, and 1 woman, okay, and each man takes his turn on that woman, and she's obviously really suffering and pain and all this kind of thing. These are the actual examples they use in the meta-ethics, by the way. I'm not trying to be inappropriate here. Anyway, so in this scenario, there's more men having fun, enjoying themselves, getting pleasure. And the woman here it's 10-to-1 ratio, isn't it? So 10 men are having a good time, versus 1 woman who's not having a good time. So on strict utilitarian grounds, why should we ban gang rape? We should allow gang rape. We should, even if we put this with other examples, we should allow these examples, right? So Mill, this was his point of contention, if you want to put it, the bone of contention that he had. He said, look, actually, and this is why he put the harm principle in place. So it can facilitate non-chaotic, non-anarchical kind of structures whereby you can have as much fun as you want and pleasure and so on. It's great, it's good for us, so long as you don't harm anyone else. So the gang rape scenario would be disqualified on a million understanding, but it would be plausible, if you want, on the Bentham model. Okay, but remember, I mentioned James Mill because this is the family that John Stuart Mill was from. Okay, John Mill was his father. Sorry, James Mill was his father, and Jeremy Bentham was his father's friend. So this is he's growing up and he's being told these things. It's being justified to him. He's learning the arguments from his father and from his father's friend. So what kind of evidence? So let's see. We already spoke about the greatest happiness principle and what that holds. So this is what the proof is for Mill. So what? Because the question is, how do you prove that this is what we should be doing? Because when you say the word "should," now we're talking about morality. That we should be predicating morality based on how pleasurable we find things or how desirable things are. So this is what Mill says. Mill says the only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And similarly, with other sources of our experience, in like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually desire it. If happiness, the end that the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself, were not acknowledged in theory and in practice to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person it was an end. It seems like encrypted language, but we'll come to this, and there have been kind of modern day formulations of this. James Mill is a bit more candid, his father, and in his works, because he's written works, he wrote, the desire, therefore, of that power which is necessary to render the persons and properties of human beings subservient to our pleasures is the grand governing law of human nature. So what he's saying is, why should we predicate our morality on the idea of we'll do whatever it is that makes us happy and feel pleased and feel desirable to us? James Mill is saying it's an axiom. It's just because it's self-evident. Now what does that mean? It means we're not going to provide any evidence, because an axiom by definition is something which cannot be proven or it doesn't have evidence to it. So he's just saying it's human nature. You are born actually with this this thing where you just your pleasures and desires come naturally to you, and so you just, that's the evidence. So the evidence is no evidence. Let's say this is the evidence. The evidence is no evidence, and the argument is continued. Okay, so James Mill, in his essay on governments, he says each person acts only or predominantly to promote his own interest. Now, in in ethics, there are two schools of thought which we will actually cover and do a special treatment on them. One of them is called egoism. Okay, now ethical egoism is the idea that we are, we only pursue our own interests. We don't care about anybody else. We just want what's good for us. What is the opposite of egoism?
Altruism.
Yes, very good. Yes, very good. The opposite of egoism is altruism, which is that in fact we're living for other people. We're living for our family. I live for my, you've heard this before, I live for my daughter, I live for my son, I live for my mum, I live for my wife, whatever it may be, for the country, for patriotism, nationalism, all of that, living for someone else, okay? And both of those things, from our perspective as Muslims, are very poor ways to conduct your morality, okay? Both egoism and altruism. Okay, both of those are poor ways, but we'll come to that separately, and in fact we'll have sessions on those because they're very important. But as we'll come to, Mill, especially John Stuart Mill, has been interpreted as being an ethical egoist. Okay, even Henry Sidgwick, who is himself probably one of the top 3, if not the top 5 utilitarians that ever lived, he interprets him as being an ethical egoist. He says that he's an ethical egoist. Why? Because he's talking about whatever serves one's own interest. Though I have to also add here that there is some level of contention on that point. I've mentioned that actually here. It's on the the next slide. So we spoke about Bentham's greatest good. Let's have a pause here, and let's see what some of the issues that you can think about are. So how many people we've got here? Okay, well, you can do. I think we can work in groups of on pairs. Let's do a group in pairs. So we'll do you two, okay, inshallah. You two, and then maybe you can come with them. We'll do a quick one, 10-15 minutes discussion, yeah, on what are some of the issues with these contentions. Okay, what already are you seeing? Some of the issues with these contentions, that we should maximize our own pleasure. Why is this problematic in your eyes? Or, if anything, what is appealing about it as well? So what are some of the issues here? I'll give you 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll record. We'll continue the recording. All right. So let's get some feedback, please, on what we've spoken about. What are some of the issues with utilitarianism, the way we've described it? What are some of the issues that you've been able to identify? Yes, go ahead, please. But we need someone else because this is the second time you make a contribution. Okay, let's, Ahmad.
Yeah, first of all, James Mill is saying that it's an axiom, the utilitarian principle being an axiom.
Yeah.
We could disagree with it because fundamental characteristic of axioms seem to be that they are universal, but this doesn't seem to be the case. So that's one issue. And then the easiest...
How is that? You said that a fundamental characteristics of an axiom is that it's universal, and this doesn't seem to be the case. Can we play around with that? What do you mean? What do you mean by that? How is this not the case? What is this that you're talking about in the first place?
Oh yeah, the utilitarian principle that maximizing pleasure or pleasure and pain should be the yardstick for moral values.
Before that, there's something, right? Hedonism, desire, yeah. So okay, now you're saying we don't know if that's universal, that everyone. What could be a competitor to it, or what could it be instead of it?
No. Okay. I'm not saying that pleasure and pain is not the lowest common denominator. That's not the argument here.
Okay.
The argument is that should be considered the yardstick for moral value. Isn't?
No, but remember, he's not making at this juncture. He will. I mean, his son will make this point. We'll come to it. But at this juncture, he's just saying that this is something we all have
right.
intrinsically.
If that's the case, then the corollary to that, which his son will make, which is therefore that should be the yardstick. We could refute by using the David Hume's ease versus odd problem, which is just because something is a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that it ought to be that way.
Right. Yeah, you could refute that if the argument stopped at where it is, but we'll see that the argument doesn't stop where it is. We're going to come to some of the logical forms of what Mill, he tries to at least make the argument. When I read it, I've read it many times. I actually came across Plato Encyclopedia. They tried to put it in almost like a L1 format, propositional logic, and we'll come to that in one of the slides and how they actually try and make an argument. But that's a good contribution. You're definitely on the right tracks. It's a good contribution. Okay, let's see. Al-Rahman, how about yourself? What did you come to? You got nothing?
Are we arguing against hedonism?
You could do. It's part of these. We said any of the issues. We kept
one
it
thing
quite
we
open.
said, so the axiom is assuming that it's almost innate within us to maximize pleasure.
Yeah.
Or we give the example of there's loads of scenarios where humans don't choose pleasure.
Yes.
So for example, we give the example if a mother had a child that was disabled or severely disabled, and she chose to keep it, and then that would essentially decrease her pleasure in life because she always has to look after the kid, go to appointments, takes up her time, takes up her leisure time. So she purposely chose something that's essentially going to make her life harder. So she's not choosing pleasure in that scenario.
I think this is actually one of the things that I mentioned, altruism and stuff like that. Now, when we get to egoism versus altruism, we'll get to more of how an egoist would respond to that. Someone like Ayn Rand, who would say, well, ultimately, why is she doing that? Is she doing that to decrease another kind of pain that she would be feeling had she not done whatever she's doing?
Okay.
You see the point?
Well, it's definitely against sensual pleasure, isn't it?
No, I'm not saying that she's right or wrong. This is a very, very difficult question to get to the bottom of in terms of, how do we assert this, right? But the egoist will say, well, the example of the mother you gave, she couldn't live with herself had she not done what she done.
Okay.
And that psychological torment, they will argue, is actually an attempt to minimize pain, a different kind of pain. So there's two pains going on here. There's the pain of giving birth, and there's the pain of the psychological, which I can't live with myself. And what she's essentially doing is she's prioritizing one pain over the other. You see,
how would they know though? Like, what if she just feels indifferent about it and it wouldn't cause any? What if she's just indifferent? Like, if I bought this baby, it's nothing to me.
Right. These are very fundamental questions, very important ones. But I'm giving you something to think about. Right?
Okay.
I'm not saying that you're wrong in your initial postulation here. You could be absolutely right, but these things are difficult to assert full stop.
Okay.
Whether we are trying to, or whether such a thing as altruism even exists. But it's conceivable that it does exist. It is conceivable that altruism exists. It's not a logical impossibility that I would want to live and do something for something greater than me, whether it's my country or my religion or my family, whatever it may be, right? But some would argue, well, you're doing it, and the egoist would say this, ultimately for your own sake. And the egoist would push, because there's psychological egoism, by the way, and there is ethical egoism. There's two types of egoism, okay? And we shouldn't conflate between the two. So the psychological egoism is how you operate as a human being and what you will resort to, whereas the ethical egoism is how you should operate as a human being, you see. But what we're going to be covering is more the ethical side rather than the psychological side. But this is a good contribution, but think about what we're talking about. I'm not going to give you all the answers. Just think about it, let it ferment in your mind a little bit. Any other one more contribution before we continue?
About addiction.
Yes.
You maximize the pleasure, but ultimately you're destroying your own body, and you're ultimately going to end up being a detriment to society, because you're going to have to go to hospitals and what do they call them? The clinics, rehabilitation clinics, and also in terms of the homosexual thing. They're, in a sense, they're kind of destroying their bodies over the long term, spreading what could be seen as bad diseases, and that's also a detriment, harmful for society as a whole.
These are arguments that actually can be made. So, for example, the question of a homosexual person is 10 times more likely, according to some stats, to be a carrier of AIDS or a carrier of sexually transmitted diseases, right? So someone can make a communitarian or even a utilitarian, quite frankly, argument, and say, well, if what we're looking at is the greatest good for the greatest number, and we're also talking about the harm principle, then isn't allowing such practice going to cause more harm in the long term and in general than pleasure for the majority of people? Or these are very, very valid arguments on utilitarian grounds. But what will usually prevail here is a sense of individualism, okay? And we'll come to this. In fact, we have an entire session, once again, on individualism because it's that important. But on the individualist level, they think that the best person who knows what's best for them is that you are your own God, if you like. You know what's best for you. That's what they think, you know. So, in a sense, usually a liberal response would be, well, that should be left to the individual, okay? But yeah, you can certainly make an argument. It's not like you can't make an argument on those levels. Now, let's come back to the slides, because there is something which I want to. I came across this. Before I show it to you, it's important for me to kind of. A lot of the stuff we're going to be doing throughout these sessions is going to reference L1 logic. Okay, you know, logic has different, languages. L1, which is propositional logic. L2, predicate logic. You have modal logic. S5, you have... Actually, there's different kinds of logic, yeah? Now, L1 is, in philosophy, it comes up quite a lot, okay? And it's not that difficult, to be honest with you, to know it. There's like 9 rules that you have to know, okay? Now, these particular rules or syllogisms of some sorts are going to be presented to us, and we need to know how to interpret them. But what I will say today, because there is a syllogism here of some sorts, is there is a difference between validity and soundness. Okay, there is a difference between validity and soundness. So a valid argument is an argument which the conclusions follow naturally from the premises. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. But you can have a valid argument which is also unsound. You can say I don't know. You can say either God doesn't exist. Either 2 + 2 = 5 or God doesn't exist. 2 + 2 = 4 or God doesn't exist. 2 + 2 = 4, therefore God doesn't exist. I mean, if someone presented this to you, you'd say, what would you say? You'd say, we don't agree with the premise. You see, you don't have to agree with the premise. You can sometimes have valid language, logical language, but it's unsound because the premises don't really care. I mean, it's a closed language, if you like. It doesn't care about the outside world in a way. It's like computer programming. It's just like, when you're doing code or whatever, you're just creating valid algorithm. But those, those formulations don't have any relevance to the truth, if we go back to a correspondence theory, kind of epistemology, of the actual world. It can be fiction. We make a computer game, okay? As we've mentioned, we are creating a new virtual reality, but it's not a reality in the actual world. So it's a closed system. So when we're looking at syllogisms and arguments, remember, we don't have to agree with the premises. Okay, so look at the first. This is from Plato Encyclopedia. By the way, they're a good resource. Stanford and Plato, they do a good job in breaking down like heavy philosophical topics and trying to think. So this is a redaction, or if you like, a reconstruction of a particular chapter in a book written by J.S. Mill on utilitarianism, where they try and put it in syllogistic format. So utilitarianism is true if this is Mill's argument, but redacted. Yeah. Utilitarianism is true if happiness is the one and only thing desirable for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. That's the first and most important premise. Talk to the person next to you, okay, for the next 2 minutes just, and tell us what you think could be problematic with this premise. Okay? 3 minutes. Go ahead. Okay. So we saw the syllogism there. Can we comment on some of the premises and see some of the contentions there, if they're adding up or not?
Do you want critique just of the first premise or the whole argument?
First premise is fine.
Yeah, just like I'm not sure if that first premise is true, like that, because I don't think that's all that's required for you.
Can you tell us what the first premise is?
So it says that that utilitarianism is true and only true, right? If happiness is the one and only thing desirable for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. And so we were kind of thinking that that's not all that's required for utilitarianism to be true, because even
why is it not?
Because this is sort of just saying that you only have like an basically, as long as individuals just seek happiness for its own sake, then utilitarianism is true. But utilitarianism is a bit more than that, because within utilitarianism you could have a scenario where an individual would have to sacrifice their individual happiness to guarantee the overall happiness of the society. So you also have to have that extra step, which is that, you know, that you aggregate it out as a community, and you sometimes have to sacrifice and sometimes have to keep, and all of those oughts kind of have to be true as well.
Okay. So putting it in a word, the first premise doesn't consider something. You're nearly there. There's a bit what you were saying before. What were you saying before?
Ease was the odd distinction, right?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. If utilitarianism, if you define it as maximizing pleasure and minimizing gain, is good. If you agree with, they're saying that that principle is true. If happiness is the one and only thing desirable for its own sake, but even if you agree that happiness is the one and only thing desirable for its own sake, that doesn't necessarily mean that therefore we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain.
So it's moving from a psychological distinction to an ethical one.
Right. Yeah. Because
in the first premise, it's just telling us the state of nature.
Right.
But it's not telling us anything about ethics.
Right.
This is extremely important. In fact, it's so important that this has been so heavily refuted in moral philosophy. So heavily refuted. In fact, the credentials of Mill has been put into question, especially in his use of the word desirable, by the way, which we'll come to. But anything else on this point, because this is actually the most important point, that the first premise itself is unjustifiable, actually, completely unjustifiable. Why would utilitarianism, which is what? Utilitarianism is a moral system. It's a system of what? Right and wrong. When we say moral system, what differentiates a psychological state from a moral system is what? The words ought, the words oughtn't, the words should, the words shouldn't, the words right, the words wrong, the words good, the words bad. This is good, this is bad. This is right, this is wrong. You should do this, you shouldn't do this. Now, this is so important because all of what we're talking about today, you should leave them alone to practice homosexual sex in their homes or whatever, because they're not harming. You shouldn't intervene. You should do this, you should. But all of this is predicated on this first premise, which we have seen doesn't even involve a moral element. You see, the first premise is lacking in something here. The first premise is lacking in anything which is moral anyways. There's no mention of morality. There's no mention of shouldn't do. How do you get from this is the case to this should be the case? And this is right. This is a David Hume. At this point now, this point that you made before makes very good sense. Where he's trying to prove utilitarianism. He's trying to prove principle of utility. Yeah. At this point, he is in trouble. Okay. But there's even more problems here. Okay. What are some more problems that you find in this way of reasoning? Has anyone identified any other problems? I've given you a hint. In fact, I'll give you a minute. Look at the next slide, because it has some of the answers, okay? Look at the next slide. I'll give you exactly 1 minute, 60 seconds in your own time. Look at the next slide and come and when you're ready, yeah? Yeah, good. You're thinking, yeah? This is the first time I see you guys putting your hands on your forehead and really scratching your heads and stuff like that. You know, and struggling with this, with the subject matter. That's what it should be. Don't worry, I had the same experience, I mean, when I looked at this the first time. Let's look at the second premise, guys, together, yeah? Just the second premise. The only proof, it's almost incriminating what he says. The only proof of desirability is desire. It sounds tautological, actually. The only proof for your belief in God is your belief in God. Okay, well, you're saying the same thing twice. What do you mean the only proof for desirability is desire? What does that actually mean? There has to be a distinction between desirability and desire if the only proof for desirability is desire. And why should it be a proof anyway? These are just assertions at this point. The only proof for desirability is desire. Let me scratch my head, let me think about that. This doesn't make sense. This is the problem. This is why we're not getting it. Because it's nonsensical, it's invalid. Why is it invalid? Because the way this guy has used the word desire, okay, you'll see it in the, what does he mean by desire? He means, is it something worthy of being done? Something that should or shouldn't be done? Or is it something that one wants to do? These terms are being played around with here. Are we saying, in the second premise, the only proof that something is worthy or something should or shouldn't be done or ought or oughtn't be done or something is right or wrong is that people do it? Is that what we're saying? We say that's no proof at all. Simple as that. That's no proof at all. That doesn't satisfy my, doesn't satiate my hunger, my intellectual hunger. It doesn't quench my academic thirst. It does nothing for me. It hasn't satisfied me. Has it satisfied you? Don't think it's satisfied me. What do you mean? The only proof? Let's think about this, guys, please. The only proof for desirability, which is that something should or shouldn't be done, or that something should be thought of in those ways, is that people desire it.
People desire everything. Like, different people desire different things. Everything can be desired. So, what is he saying?
No. Yeah. He doesn't care about that. We are jumping again. How are we jumping?
It's plausible that people could desire bad things or immoral things.
No. Don't say this, because remember, he is establishing morality. He's not talking bad things. Then you're begging the question, and you have this bad thing already, and no. It's not that people could be. He's saying what? He's saying what you said before. Okay, this is how it is. Therefore, it's how it should be. Or the only proof that things should be the way they are is that they are the way they are.
As in, from what point of view then? From the point of view of like utilitarianism? Like in that moral framework?
No, we're not even there yet.
Not even there.
We're not even there yet.
So when he says it should be like that, why is he based it on?
This is the question.
Oh.
This is the $1 million question. What are you in fact, can we see that he's basing it on any? Has he got something basing on it? I really want you to struggle with this, guys. Is there any evidence here?
Like he's just saying that the only proof that you desire something is that you desire it. Like it doesn't.
Yeah, and this is called the fallacy of equivocation.
Yeah.
Because, unless you differentiate between the two terms here.
Mm.
What desirability means something that you ought to do, and desire is something you are doing. So the only proof that you ought to do this thing is that you already are doing it.
Yeah, it's bad.
That's a cyclical argument. That's a cyclical argument. It is that bad. It is really that bad. Now you imagine. We've played around with it. One more premise. Each person desires his own happiness for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. So this is hence happiness as such is desired for its own sake is desired. So this is something that is happening, not something that should be happening. Just remember the word should. Right now in premise 3, okay, and 4, there's no shoulds. There's just this is. It's a psychological disposition. Hence, happiness as such is desired for its own sake, not for something else, from the point of view of humanity. Now he's moving on to the aggregate of persons. Even if we go with that, no problem. It's a psychological disposition for the sake of argument. Hence, happiness as such is desirable. You see what he's doing here, this guy? He thinks, what, we're not going to read this, or we're not going to analyze this or something? He went from it's being done to what? What's desirable? Yeah, it is desirable, but what do you mean by desirable? My question, is it or ought? My question is it ought? If it's desirable, now you're moving from are you moving to ought? Are you moving to, even if you are, how can you move to ought? How is that? Okay, it's happening, therefore it should happen. If it's not, it is happening, therefore it should happen, there'll be tautology again. It's happening, therefore it's happening. So you've got two problems. Either you're saying it's happening, therefore it's happening. It's psychological, therefore it's psychological, which is T, which is tautology. Or you're saying it's happening, therefore it should be happening, which is the law of excluded middle. You've missed out something here that we don't know. You haven't even put something in the middle. You've missed something out here in the syllogism. So it's a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. Now, I want you to remember something, and you can look at the rest of this syllogism. But this is the dominant ethic in the West. You'd expect the dominant ethic in the superpower and its extensions to have something a little bit more than that. Like, honestly, do you know, this is an invalid argument. It's not even just unsound. We said you can have a valid argument, you can have everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. This is a famous cosmological syllogism, yeah? Now, no one's going to deny its validity. It's a valid argument, 100%. Is it sound? That's what the philosophers deny or reject or accept or whatever. This syllogism is invalid. It's not possible in any possible world. This is impossible. You cannot derive the conclusions from those premises. And you're telling me that this is your evidence for everything you're telling us to do and not to do? Why does your religion allow this? Why does your religion allow that? What's the assumption? Why does your religion allow this such and such punishment? Why does your religion allow such and such thing? Why is your religion doesn't allow anyone to just have a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship? Why is it so conservative, they'll say? Ultra conservative and all, this kind of language that they have. Why? Okay. So what's the assumption when you say that? That's antinormative, at least, or aberrational. Strange. That's strange. What is the norm then? What should it be? It could be implied that the assumption is that it should be in the liberal paradigm. But okay, no problem, it's in the liberal paradigm. Prove us the liberal paradigm. Please tell us what the evidence for the liberal paradigm is from a social perspective. The evidence of the liberal paradigm is you desire things, therefore you should desire things. Put it in one word. You desire things, you like things, therefore you should like it, so long as you don't harm anyone else because of the aggregate thing. Okay, no. How about that? How about give me some proper evidence? How about you don't go into the countries with swords and you're spreading liberalism by the sword for something that has no evidence? It doesn't even have evidence. It's a failure. It is a philosophical failure, but it's a popular failure. Just like the flat earth model, just like many things that were popular in the past. But so the main thing now, going to Islamic, if you like, polemics, whatever it is when people ask you a question, you always have to assess what? The assumption of the question. Because especially if it's moral, it usually have social liberal assumptions or socially liberal feministic assumptions. And once you realize that these are the assumptions we're dealing with, then you realize what? We're not going to deal with the question. We're going to deal with the assumptions of the question. And if you deal with the assumptions of the question, you're sweeping the opponent, or you're sweeping the rug under the foot of the opponent. Okay, and we're going to do our session now, discussion, and with that we conclude. And hopefully that was as fruitful for you as it was for me. Now you can go back to these particular slides if you have access. If not, we'll try and provide access for them. وجزاكم الله خير والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.